Hi, I'm Tod Bolsinger of the Dupree Center for Church Leadership Initiative. This is Tempered Resilience. They had become so focused on the aches and pains in the system that they'd been thrown off course by the complaints. They'd stopped supplying vision, or had burned out fighting the resistance. They had ceased to be the strength in the system. In short, they'd forgotten to lead. Ed Friedman. About 10 years ago, when I was traveling the country for a project for my denomination, I began to hear pastors whisper to me in a moment of head-shaking sadness and tiredness. It was the same whisper that I heard when I would consult or coach, and oftentimes I'd heard people say it even amongst my colleagues and friends. They would say, seminary didn't prepare me for this. Many people experienced that they loved their seminary their time in seminary. They loved their seminary experience. They loved what they learned, but they felt like what they had learned hadn't prepared them for this world that we were now trying to lead in. Fast forward to 2015. Canoeing the Mountains has just come out, a book that I wrote in response to that whisper, a book that says that we need to have a different way of leading in a rapidly changing world. And that when we feel as if we are off the map and in uncharted territory, we can't rely on our expertise of the past, but have to learn as we go, face losses, and navigate competing values to address the underlying issues that are keeping us from actually being able to change and fulfill our mission. As I would travel around the country 100,000 miles a year, talking to different groups, and sometimes even in other countries around the world, eventually there would be a second whisper. It usually came from the person who invited me, the district superintendent, the bishop, the executive presbyter, the head of training or leadership development. And after hearing my presentation on adaptive leadership, they would say, I don't know if we have anybody who can actually do this. I would be just flummoxed. I would think, oh my gosh, I've got to do a better job of training. And yet what I would realize at that moment when I listened deeper, is that this wasn't actually something about training. You see, they weren't saying we need better training. They were actually saying something else. One person put it to me this way: I don't know if we have anybody who has the stomach to actually do this. A senior pastor that I work with put it this way, said, I don't worry about whether I can learn to lead change. I worry about whether I can survive it. One of the principles and practices for leading adaptive change that everybody wanted to talk about was the chapter on sabotage. It says, you haven't succeeded until you survive the sabotage. Or as what we learned in the book is, once you've actually executed a change, then the sabotage happens. And after you've survived the sabotage, well then, and only then, can you feel successful in the change process. Edwin Friedman, if you're a leader, expect sabotage. Friedman again, the most important aspect of leadership. The capacity of a leader to be prepared for, to be aware of, and to learn how to skillfully deal with sabotage may be the most important aspect of leadership. It's literally the key to the kingdom. So what do we mean about sabotage? We mean the natural, normal, and to be expected process of people responding to change. Again, it's normal, it's natural, it's to be expected. When you gather a group of people together, or you're called by a group of people to lead them into a new missional endeavor, a new day, a new revival, a new revitalization, and you begin to take steps in that direction, it is natural, it is normal, and it is to be expected that the very same people who asked you to lead them will resist your leadership. Sabotage is not the bad things that evil people do. It's the human things that anxious people do. It's normal, it's natural, and it's to be expected. But it still has to be navigated if you're going to be a good adaptive leader. In the story of the Exodus, we discover two different ways of responding to sabotage. And they both end up oftentimes resulting in a failure on the part of a leader. Ed Friedman talked about what he called a failure of nerve. It is that when the people who have been rescued from Egypt want to go back to Egypt, which they tell Moses they want to do 6 weeks after the miracle of the Red Sea. Oh, they killed our children, but we had leeks and onions for lunch. They complain against God. They complain against God's servant Moses. And at that moment, many of us, hearing the complaints and the discouragement and the disillusionment of our people, we collude with them. We want to calm them down. We want them to feel better. We want them to approve of what we are doing. And so very quickly, before we know it, we have had a failure of nerve, and we have colluded with the status quo, and we've taken our people back, sometimes even back into slavery. But there's another failure, and sometimes it is even more deadly to the soul of a leader. It's what I call the failure of heart. A failure of heart is when a leader becomes cynical, discouraged, disconnected, disappointed in their own people. We see this in Numbers 11. After God has provided miraculous manna every morning for months and months on end, the people grumble again. Leeks and onions. Now Moses has had enough with them. He goes to God and literally says, God, if this is the people you want me to lead, you can kill me now. You can just put me to death. And many of us as pastors feel the same way. The congregation that called us with such hope and expectation to want to make a difference in our world and in our community, after a while starts grumbling and pining for the old days. We just want to go back. We just want what's familiar. We just want it to be comfortable for us. And we find ourselves, if we can overcome the failure of nerve, pretty soon after a while, we find ourselves feeling cynical and discouraged, disillusioned, disconnected. We don't say, put me to death, at least not literally. But we might think to ourselves, maybe I can sell real estate. Maybe I could go into life insurance. Or in my case, maybe I could be a national park ranger and do trail maintenance. Oh man, walk in the woods every day, not have to listen to any of these people. Sabotage causes both a failure of nerve and a failure of heart. The internal resistance of our people is much more deadly and dangerous to most of us as leaders than any external challenge we face. It is that internal resistance that we've got to develop the capacity to overcome. It's that internal resistance that leads us to know that we need to deal with resilience. How do we find resilience to face resistance? How do we find the resilience to overcome a failure of nerve and a failure of heart? Well, it's not found, it's formed. Resilience is formed in the very crucible of leadership. The resilience that we need to overcome the internal resistance of our people and the resistance that leads us to a failure of nerve and a failure of heart is a formation process that takes place right in the very act of leading. August 28th, 1963, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood before a crowd of 250,000 people. He'd been up all night working on his speech, this speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial that would become known as the I Have a Dream speech. But actually, the I Have a Dream section wasn't there. He prepared a completely different speech with a completely different emphasis. But when he found himself about 2/3 through his manuscript and realizing it wasn't having the effect that he wanted and hoped for, he paused for just a moment. And the gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, who was sitting beside him, yelled out, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." He slid his manuscript off to the side. Clarence B. Jones, who was one of his friends and speechwriters, turned to the person next to him and said, "These people don't know it, but they're about to go to church." And Martin Luther King Jr. launched into the dream that begins with a vision in Isaiah 40. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. Every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. He was looking at a whole bunch of people. Many of them had come from the South, from the dogs and the hoses and the jail cells. And he was saying to them, we're going to go back. We're going to go back to the marching and back to the sit-ins and back to the speaking up for justice and back to the hoses and the dogs and the jail cells. Why? Because God has given us a vision of a day that is going to be transformed. And because of this dream, because of this vision of the way the world is going to be, we go back to the South. We are resilient. We stand in and continue to do the work that our people have been doing for hundreds of years. With this faith, I go back to the South. With this faith, we'll be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we'll be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. What do you do when you face a mountain of despair? Do you try to bash through it like with a sledgehammer? or blow it up with dynamite or cower in front of it and give up? How about hew it, transform it? Can you believe that maybe the very resistance that you are facing is the thing that God wants to transform into the stone of hope, the stone that can be built like living stones into a dwelling place for God, a place where God's very presence is known in the world? With this faith, we'll be able to hew out of the mountain of despair, stone of hope. So how do we become a tool that can hew? A hewing tool is a chisel, not a sledgehammer. It's a tool that is tempered. It is both stronger than it was in its raw material and also more flexible because of the way that it has been shaped and formed. And this is exactly the forming process that we have to go through. I call it tempered resilience. And tempered resilience is a grounded identity and a resilient character that is shaped through reflection, relationships, and a rule of life in a rhythm of leading and not leading. Notice it's formed, it's shaped. Like raw material is turned into a chisel that can hew. It is a grounded identity and resilient character that is shaped through reflection, relationships, and a rule of life in a rhythm of leading and not leading. So my wife and I took a blacksmithing class. There is an urban blacksmithing community in Los Angeles, California. There hasn't been a horse there in 100 years. But there are a group of artisan blacksmiths who gather in an industrial park. And when you walk in the room to be able to learn blacksmithing, you realize you walk into a place where serious work is done. They make you sign your name on a piece of paper that says that this is dangerous. And they immediately give you some tongs and a steel. And the steel you put into the fire, into the forge, that it begins to melt it down, and you are blacksmithing. They don't even give you a full safety lecture before you're blacksmithing. They do the rest of it while the steel is being melted down from hard into molten. And it is that place that we find ourselves needing to be continually brought to be transformed into a tool that can hew. We become a tempered leader, and it starts in the leading. It starts in the actual work of leadership. And this is one of the challenges that we have as leaders. The very moment that we become a leader is right after the moment that we were successful at something that was not leading. You know, you're the best preacher or speaker, so they make you the pastor. You're the best salesperson on your team, so you become the sales manager. You're one of the best players, so you become the coach. You're one of the best scholars, so you become the dean. But what you've just done is move from being an expert in something that's not leading to a beginner at something that is leading. And that experience is one of vulnerability, especially in adaptive challenges. When you go into uncharted territory and everybody looks at you and says, you've been an expert, so now what is your expert opinion about what we should do now to move forward in this uncharted territory, in this uncertain, disruptive world? And you have to say with complete integrity and truthfulness and vulnerability, I don't know. I don't know, but we're going to learn as we go. We're going to face those losses. We're going to figure out what we are supposed to be. And it's going to be hard. And that experience of vulnerability is the starting place. Like the way the steel is melted down because it becomes molten. It is heated to 2,000 degrees until it becomes almost oozy. Now it can take the shaping. Resilient leadership is a process that begins in heating through leading and reflection, holding through personal and professional relationships, hammering through spiritual practices and the practice of leadership, and quenching through the rest and slow release of leadership responsibilities. This is how we become a tempered tool, through reflection, relationships, and practices in a rhythm of leading and not leading. It is a process of formation that happens in the process of leading. That starts with the vulnerability, that it must be held by relationships, that requires you to use a different set of spiritual practices that will strengthen you and give you wisdom and capacity, and ultimately causes you to live in a rhythm of leading and not leading. This process creates qualities that lead to resilience. Through spiritual practices that are lived out in the process of reflection, relationships, and in that rule of life, we become teachable and attuned, adaptable and tenacious. And a grounded identity that is formed into a teachable or humble leader, an attuned or empathic leader, an adaptable and creative leader, and a tenacious and persevering leader becomes a resilient tool that can hew. But it all starts in grounding. At this time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. The moment he came out of the water, he saw the sky split open and God's Spirit looking like a dove come down on him. Along with the Spirit, a voice, "You are my Son, chosen and marked by my love, pride of my life." What I would like you to know as a leader, especially one who might be facing adaptive challenges, uncharted territory, the uncertainty of a broken and changing, disrupted world, is that you need to be grounded in something more than your success as a leader. This is one of the great ironies. Your capacity to resilience requires you to be grounded in something other than your commitment to being a resilient leader. You need to be like Jesus, who before he'd said a word, spoken a sermon, done a miracle, cast out a demon, confronted a power, before he did anything, he was first told, "You are my beloved child, chosen and marked by my love, pride of my life." Dear friends, you need to be grounded in the love of Jesus that holds you and knows you before you do anything else. And being grounded in that love, like the raw steel material that can then be shaped through the fire of reflection, held on the anvil of relationships, hammered into shape and strength through spiritual practices, and tempered through a rhythm of leading and not leading. Know that it starts in this: you are loved. You are chosen. You are marked by God's love and the pride of God's life. Let yourself be grounded in that reality as you become a resilient, adaptive leader. Amen.